Hello, my name is Clara Maveglia and I set up the Cultural Entrepreneurship Institute in Berlin. Today we are in Munich at the Ludwig Maximilian University. My guest is Wilhelm Vossenkuhl. He is philosophy professor here. Welcome to our community. Schön, dass Sie da sind.
Nice to see you,
Professor Vossenkuhl.
Professor Vossenkuhl. Would you like to introduce yourself? Yes, I'm Wilhelm Vossenkuhl, and for 3 years I've been Professor Emeritus for Philosophy at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. And I'm quite glad about the life I'm leading now because I have a lot of time to read, to write, and to teach a little. Apart from that, I'm doing much more with my family as I ever did before, and I think that's wonderful. You are still a very popular professor, and a lot of people read your books. There is even an asteroid named after you. Why are you so successful? I think it's because I have been involved in a series or several series of TV programs for a Bavarian channel with Harald Lesch, and Harald Lesch is really the driving force behind this program. For years on ZDF, the national broadcaster, he's been working on this series about the cosmos. And because I was involved in that, my face got a bit more familiar. I don't think anyone would know me otherwise. And this asteroid that was named after me, I thought that was a great honour. I hope it never hits the Earth and doesn't cause any damage. Okay, but of course, people would like to hear a bit more about you personally. So, what influenced you? What made you the person you are? What do you think? First of all, I'm quite sure my family, my origins. Most of my childhood and teenage years, until I did my advanced school certificate, my Abitur, I grew up in the country. I had to commute to school, to grammar school. And of course this was a very influential period because we didn't have a television or a telephone. So over those many years that I was at home, I had an incredible amount of reading to do, and that's how I ended up with philosophy, because I had so much time to read. That was a big influence. Then, of course, studying. It was a perfectly normal path. And then, of course, when I studied, it was those wild years of the late 60s, 68 and the early 70s. I didn't particularly enjoy university. I thought it was not serious enough. Of course, I was enthusiastic about all the protests. But then, after working for a few years, I took a new route. I went to Cambridge in England and started all over again, really. And that was another big influence. The way I think, my relationship with philosophy. At some point I did my postdoctoral thesis, my Habilitation, and was appointed. And I had a number of options as a university or a higher education politician, if you like. But really it was those years. My supervisor, I'm sure, had a big influence on me when I was writing my dissertation, Max Müller. He had been a pupil of Martin Heidegger. And then in Cambridge, a whole number of people had an influence on me, teaching me a completely new ideal in thinking. So I'm the product of a number of different sources and cultures. What fascinates you about being a philosopher? I'm not so much fascinated by being a philosopher as by the philosophical issues. They're not exactly riddles, but they're difficult. But they can be put in very simple terms. For example, what role does truth play in our life, or freedom? Or what are the yardsticks in our life? Where do they come from? How are they constituted? Are there good reasons for them? Should there be good reasons for them? These are the kind of questions that concern me. And it's really those issues that I think about tirelessly and where I try to discover more sources. These are the themes that I'm still sitting writing about in the hope that sooner or later there might be something publishable. So really you're interested more in ethics. How did you come to that? Ethics is not at the moment really my primary theme. It's one of them. No, I came to ethics through Immanuel Kant. I spent a long time reading Kant very closely. The practical relevance of Kant is, well, it's a key. And I suppose increasingly I came into contact with a lot of non-philosophers, talking to them about philosophy, whether they were from the medical community or the legal community or biologists. And that was another influence on me. Sociologists was another group. I learned how relevant or not relevant philosophical questions look to other groups of people. How should you formulate philosophical questions, and do they lead anywhere? So, talking to my own colleagues, I didn't really work this out. It was only talking to people from other subjects with whom I had close links for many, many years. I was involved in research projects with them, and I really enjoyed that, and that was another big influence. But before we come on to ethics, I'm glad you just mentioned that, because I have a question. How do you bear the pressure if you are in a profession, you're a professor, you're 100% involved in your job? How do you deal with the shortage of resources like time? You want to be successful. You don't want to die without having achieved anything. Look at Schirmacher, for example, who's made us think through his death recently. People work too much these days. How do you deal with it? Of course, it damages your health, and I've experienced that myself. The death of Schirmacher really affected me. I saw him 2 weeks ago in Cologne, and he was involved in an event with Henri Levy just after I spoke, and he was still very much alive and kicking. He was 54, that's no age. Yes, the pressure is huge. People learn to deal with it, but of course, always at the expense of something, either your own health or the quality of your work, or how much time you have for your family and your friends. I think everything probably suffers from it. So that pressure isn't a particularly good pressure, neither for yourself, nor for your health, nor for what you write. If you're constantly under pressure, you usually have to finish off before you're ready to finish off. A lot of things become very provisional. I'm sure we'll come back to that on another point. That was a sidetrack, yes. Let's stick with ethics, because a lot of people are interested in that. But people think that it's something up there in the stratosphere. Let's start with what ethic actually means. Oh, a whole bundle of things. Of course, it's an artificial concept. It's been derived from the Greek word ethos. But even in Greek, there are two words, ethos and ethos. One is about conduct, our behavior, our morality, if you like. And the other thing is the etiquette we learn in order to deal with each other, derived from that. Of course, they relate to each other. And in the development, we've divided those things. Really, ethics isn't morality anymore. Even with Aristotle, in the ancient days, the two things were still the same. It was difficult to distinguish, because the right way to behave, the good way to behave, was culturally correct and therefore correct for everybody. Of course, not for the barbarians who had no idea, but for all free Greeks, it was simply the correct way to behave. Eventually, those two things were separated in the Middle Ages. It divided theology, and in the modern age, we thought we shouldn't look so much at morals because morals are influenced by religion. And people can dress this way or that way. In Bavaria, they still sometimes wear their traditional costume. In other places, they don't. In Italy, it might be diet. And the idea was all this is just secondary. Ethics are important. But actually, you can't separate those things off. Ethics is a theoretical or universalized form of morals or customs. We behave in ethics as though we're talking about morality, but actually we're not. Anything that isn't universal, can't be made universal, is cleaned out, is purged out. For example, if we're talking about circumcision of young men or babies in Judaism, young men in Islam, we don't exactly perhaps want to know all about that, this kind of behavior, whether it is ethical or not, or whether there are any ethical justifications to it. The same applies to other religious customs. And of course, Immanuel Kant pushed that because he wanted a theory for ethics. And he thought if ethics is capable of theory, then we can't pay any attention to what distinguishes cultures or religions. To him, religious things were in any way very critical business, especially given the history. And he wanted to place everything on an ethical basis, which of course you can't do with religion. But it's an invention, like most of our conceptual subject matter. It's an invention. But if you cut it off from behavior, from people's moral behavior and customs, then it becomes empty. But if you look at moral ethics now, you can see the morality is coming back into it. If people are opposed to embryos being used as commodities and turned into stem cells, then that's to do with morality. It's not to do with ethics. Ethics would have to be able to look at those moral differences that some people want stem cells because they say we can do medical research, others don't. So the ethics experts have to say, okay, what's important to say here? Ethics can be for it or against it. But ethics itself doesn't offer you a tool to say they're right and they're wrong. You have to learn to deal with the conflict, and that is really the main theme of ethics today. How do you deal with the conflicts that develop from those moralities, those moral forms of behavior, different religions, different cultures, different origins? We don't want to give those things up. They play a huge role, perhaps not so much in our neck of the woods as in the Middle East, or amongst the Muslims, where you've got those differences now between Sunnis and Shiites, which are now apparently so extreme that they're waging war against each other. You can't say to them, oh, I tell you what, give up your religious convictions, then you can live in peace. That's absurd. Ethics is no longer, we simply have to accept it, can't be seen in isolation from moral problems, but the idea is to provide an authority or a method for resolving or formulating those problems. But the problem won't go away, it remains a dilemma. What's so interesting is that if you look at medical ethics, biological ethics, environmental ethics, we can see from that that you can't divide ethics off from customs. You can't look top down at people's behavior and say, oh no, this is all religiously founded or culturally driven and therefore it's nonsense. Okay, so a question to come back to these apparently so simple questions. Are people good? If we can't assume, if we don't want to assume that there is good in human beings, I don't know what we could offer as a substitute. Perhaps, are we all evil? Okay, we all know sayings like, men are all brutes, or whatever. Maybe sometimes it's justified even, but without the assumption that we human beings have a disposition to be good, we don't know what else to assume. What would be better to assume? But we know that not everyone, including ourselves, are truly, really good through and through. It's an ideal. We have ideal views which we live with. We assume we can be good, we know how to do it, or we would know how to do it if we tried. We'd simply have to decide we want to do it. So we have intellectually the tools, behaviorally we have the tools, we just don't always do it. And that is the unfortunate bit. But we do have the disposition. So when, as newborns, when we come to this earth, are we all good? Yes, I'm sure we are. And our upbringing, our education twists a lot. A lot of people can't compensate for a poor upbringing, but there are also counterexamples. There are amazing personalities who had a miserable, wretched youth and childhood, but somehow they've pulled themselves together. We can't all do that. Unfortunately, the abilities in that direction have been unequally spread out. But we are born as good creatures. Well, that's very reassuring. But how much is a human life worth? It's interesting that on the one hand, one can't actually say that, and probably wouldn't want to say that and shouldn't want to say that, I imagine. On the other hand, it's constantly being done. If you conclude a life insurance policy and you have a partner and you die, then the partner will receive a certain sum of money, which is considered an equivalent for the life or whatever you want to understand by it. Or if you have an accident and you are seriously injured and it's not your fault, someone else was to blame, then you will receive certain sums of money, sometimes a lot of money. Doesn't matter. Anyway, that's the one side to it. We look at the world and we're constantly doing our sums like this. There are so many standards and benchmarks for calculating the value of a human life or calculating the value of a limb or some human tissue. But the human being as a whole can't really be quantified because a human being is unique. You can't replace a person. If you can pay for something, that suggests that it is barterable, exchangeable. If something is unique, you can't exchange it. It's impossible. Simply in terms of commodity theory, it would be, or value theory, it would be absurd to assume that. Kant said people don't have a value, they have a dignity, which is something different, it's absolute. It's also in Article 1 of the German Constitution. And that is a Kantian thought that is reflected there. But we see again and again that this claim to dignity is relativized. We see it's being relativized by decisions such as the one I just mentioned, stem cells and the use of embryos. If human life begins in the embryonic phase and already has dignity then of course you can't relativize that, but of course it's done. And in Germany we import stem cells. There's actually a law governing how we do it. So de facto we have already relativized. Although in an ideal world we would wish the opposite. So we're a bit schizophrenic, I suppose, schizoid about the value of human life. But as you have already mentioned, there is this concept, commodities that can be paid for and others that can't. What's behind that? I wouldn't talk so much about whether they can be paid for or not, but more about goods, commodities that can be bartered or exchanged, that can be divided and shared, and others that can't. And then at least you have a kind of general plane that you can start with. You can divide or share money, or possibly air, as long as we haven't completely polluted the air, like maybe in Beijing or other places. The shareability of the air is apparently possible, or water. But we know as well that all these goods aren't infinitely shareable. So on the one hand we have shareable goods, but we also have non-shareable goods, like human organs which can be transplanted. You can't divide a kidney. You can divide a liver, but not constantly. But you can't divide a kidney. So we have to distinguish between things that can be divided and shared and things that can't. And in the latter case, and there we're looking at things like kidneys, which can save lives, there are some which are totally indispensable, and there are others which are dispensable. A kidney could be dispensable if there is enough dialysis, and if through dialysis you have a certain quality of life, or at least a bearable life. That's not always the case, though. Sometimes you have to have the transplant, and dialysis doesn't work anymore. And then the kidney is irreplaceable. But when you hear irreplaceable, you think, oh, that's a very absolute word. And in fact, the case is that relative to human life and its finiteness, there are a lot of these non-exchangeable goods which make our lives valuable. But what those things are, we can't really predict as theorists. If you imagine a situation where you have a number of goods, some of which you can share and others you can't, and someone asks, what can you dispense with? Quite simple question. Say you have a good job, well paid, you have a family, you're healthy, you have perhaps a bit of wealth, perhaps your own house. Which of those things would you dispense with if you were under pressure? You're not allowed to not give up anything. If you give up the job, you are endangering the family. You can't keep the house, you don't have a good life anymore. If you put your health up to grabs, then perhaps you can't work anymore, so everything would implode. But life teaches us that whether we want it or not, one of those goods, whether it's dividable, divisible or not, we could lose it. You might go bankrupt. Shareable goods which suddenly can't be shared anymore because there's nothing left. And then the value of all goods shifts. It's like a hydraulic process. To begin with, everything is equal. We can't dispense with everything. And then suddenly things change. If somebody becomes ill and it's life-threatening and they have assets, they have wealth, they'll probably say, I would give all I have to be healthy again so that I can enjoy a good life again, so I can engage in sport or live healthily with my family. So you see, values shift then. And for that reason, there's a limit to how much theory we can derive from all this and the conceptual foundations we can formulate by saying this is an absolute good and this isn't. But it's been done. I mean, John Rawls talked about freedom as the absolute value. Just as we have in our dignity in our constitution, he has freedom. And then you could say, okay, that means I mustn't make myself a slave, I mustn't allow others to make me a slave, I must never give consent to being a slave. But what does that mean if for a long time I don't have a job and I urgently need one? Then perhaps I might take one which is too badly paid, where I'm not exactly enslaved, but certainly badly treated. Aren't I then giving my consent to something which actually impairs my freedom? So in theory, it's all well and good if you say freedom is an absolute value, or dignity, but in practice, in life, things are a bit different. Yeah, that's really fascinating. You've mentioned technologies a few times. Can one go so far as to technologize human life, for example, through genetics? Well, you could say yes. The easy answer is no, we mustn't do that. There should be a limit to everything. But at the same time, we have to say that limit isn't respected. We have to assume that everything that can be done will be done as long as there's a business, potentially, as long as you can possibly sell it. It's always the case that it's not about good and bad, it's about how people can do business with it. If there's a business model for selling organs, it'll be done, even though it's actually forbidden in our country. Our entire Transplant Act was set up to prevent trafficking in human tissue, but it's done. Every year, thousands of organs are exported from some countries, from criminals who've been executed. They're cut out and they are sold. A lot is done where we say, at first glance, no, that's immoral, that's not allowed, that's ethically unfoundable, and yet it's done. I'm sure robots will come into being that look like human beings and fight more effectively than GIs. Kill other robots, perhaps destroy people. There's nobody up there above humanity who can say you can't do that, and you can do that. It's not done, and we have to cope with that as humanity. We have to cope with killing ourselves off. That's interesting too. What do you think about... It's being talked a lot about, for example, the professions being replaced by robots or software. There are some amazing robots out there. There are robots, for example, that transplant hips. If a robot can do it, then usually it'll do it much better than a human being because, for example, because of the quality of the technology, this metal, which is coated, can't be scratched. If it's scratched before it's used, it won't last so long. So the cementing of the hip in the bone is usually done better by a robot than by a human being. Of course, there has to be quality control, there has to be human involvement, a lot of things that robots won't do, but robots are already being used for warfare. Drones, for example, they're flying robots who have taken on the business of killing for us. You don't have to actually make soldiers risk their lives. If there's someone out there who is allegedly culpable, of course, there's no court procedure beforehand. People are killed. And there is collateral damage, okay, maybe children, women, people who weren't involved in the conflict. These are robots, and you can see what robots can do. And I'm sure there's a lot of potential there. Yes, we have to bear everything in mind if we're going to take technology that far. You talked a little bit about medical ethics before, and these potentially ethical questions in medical matters. A lot of people ask, should I give an informed consent or power of attorney for health-related issues, or should I put my personal data in a database? Can you tell us anything about that, how to behave? Yes, there are lots of things we could discuss. I'll just pick up one. You mentioned databases. For some time, on the web, there's been an offer. You can have your genetic screening done, and you pay $500. And you get a little kit, which they send you. You open it, you spit on it, you close it up and send it away, and a few weeks later you get a table telling you how likely it is that you'll get certain illnesses. Well, in Germany, I don't know whether it's more now, but 3 years ago I looked at the numbers, and there were about 20. We had 20 experts 3 years ago in the medical field who could use this data and tell you what it actually meant. Just imagine you return this kit and assume that you're going to get an easily comprehensible letter, and you see probabilities. It says 0.1 to 0.9. And probably there are some, one maybe it's not that certain, but even if you have a homogenetic congenital disease like Huntington or St. Vitus dance, then it's 100% probability of inheriting it, but then it's only likely to actually happen in 50% of cases. So usually it's not monogenetic. They are there are a lot of diseases that have many influences. Most forms of cancer are like that, for example. They will depend where you live, what you do, what you eat, whether you smoke and drink and so forth. And their probability data, what does it mean? A layperson's not going to understand. That's one problem, that we don't actually understand, but it's scary. You are made into a kind of healthy hypochondriac because there's this threatening probability in the background looming over you. There are people who have certain genes which may be a basis for some disease, but the disease never arises. What do you do when you get this kit and you pay $500 and actually it's nonsense? We all ought to be instructed in such things, and I think there's a task there for the ethics community and the medical world to say to people, don't touch it, we'll work out for you what you need when you get to that point. Of course you're going to die sooner or later. Nobody can dispute that. That's absolute. We can't survive forever. Even if you live to the age of 107 or 110, you're going to die sometime. That's what biology does. We know we have to die. And the gap between now and then, we don't know what it is, and we can't really change it for the number of years just because we have a picture of our genetic disposition. So we ought to leave it alone. But you can see, as long as people can make money with it, as long as there's a business model there, people will do it. But it makes people unhappy. It's nonsense. I think it's great that you say that, because just a year ago, I think it was, Angelina Jolie had her breast amputated because of that. And I also thought it was ridiculous, because you can't combat a predisposition. It probably is a step towards immortality, or the desire for immortality. Well, if Madame Jolie wants to have artificial breasts, that's and she did that, she looks exactly as she used to, that's fine, but it's a bad example. If she can do it for herself as a private person because she's scared, that's fine. But you can't turn that into a model for other people. What about people who can't do that, but who have the same fear? I thought that was very unfortunate. Yes, because she was sold, she was pitched as a positive model, that something that everyone could do. Yes, that was absurd, it was thoughtless. And now, with this enhancement, because this was going to be my next question, should we take what is good and make it better? Or should we only use this kind of technology for pathologies? Psychopharmaceutical drugs were originally the issue, but now it applies here as well, this enhancement. What do you think of it? To me, it's one of the themes that we are not able to make use of our freedom in order to avoid these things. Of course, it's a business too. In the US, every year, more than $20 million are spent on psychodrugs, which help people to enhance their memories. Professors and people use them, students, and I think it's revolting. I think you could also say it's not ethical, because it's a bit like doping. It's like skewing the playing field in a competitive scenario. But I think it's also revolting, because we human beings believe that we can make ourselves better by doing this. We can make ourselves better by acting better, by sticking to our promises, by meeting our commitments, by being reliable. It doesn't all hinge in whether I get a point or two more in an exam because I'm using these drugs. And quite apart from that, and this is another aspect, it's not even clear what the knock-on effects of these enhancements are. They haven't been around long enough. We simply don't know what the human brain is going to do with those stimulants in the long term, whether perhaps after 20 or 30 years we're going to need other drugs to counter the catastrophic effects of those drugs. We can see today the effects of speed and other stimulants, which people were using in discotheques back then, are making people intellectual cripples, and a lot of people are suffering from the fact that they took drugs back then because they've lost the ability to perform intellectually. We don't actually know in the long term what it means, and we're doing this without knowing what the consequences are. That is, we generously dispense with a healthy judgment. That's the worst thing you can do. If you simply throw your own judgment out of the window and behave as though it's all fine, it's naive and stupid. Well, that's fantastic that you have spoken about judgment, the ability to judge. I'd like to ask you something that seems very simple again. Is a fairness in politics possible when resources are in short supply? Fairness is imperative, and that imperative doesn't depend on whether it's possible to achieve or not. It's an imperative. It would be a poor thing if it were not an imperative. Of course we have to help people who need help, regardless whether resources are in short supply. But of course, if the pie is smaller, everyone gets less. But the question is, Rawls tried to offer a model whereby if anything is going to be carved up, the worse off get a piece too anyway. But if the pie is smaller, what happens then? Will the worse off also get less? We see a debate now about whether this so-called, what in Germany Bullhart's for, it's a social welfare benefit for those who are long-term unemployed. Is it enough to live on? It's certainly not the material basis for a life in dignity. Is 400 euros enough, or do we need more? Parallel debate on the minimum wage, which is about people being able to live off the work they provide. What is enough? What is the material pendant? How do you weigh up quantity against quality of life? That's something that theory has no answers to. The question is, how do you negotiate fairness? How do you implement fairness? That's a task for politics. Ethics can only offer a few crude guidelines. Commitments, okay. But ethics can't tell you how big that material pendant needs to be. Their politics needs to apply its own expertise and say, what do people need? What do people need if they're single, if they're bringing up a family, if they're long-term unemployed? How much support do they need from the state? Fortunately, we are at least asking these questions. There are countries in the world where they don't even ask those questions, but it is an imperative of fairness that the questions are asked and that people seek answers to them. The other question is, how well implemented is fairness? Does everyone get their fair share? And there we really have to doubt whether they do. But it's a task for politics to respond to that fairness imperative. Okay, let's come on to our last questions. As usual, we are running out of time. The most important question for a lot of people, especially those who are concerned about the environment, and it ought to be more people who are, is that we people, in the course of our lives, use up resources and destroy the environment. What's the best way to deal with that dilemma? There isn't even remotely a meaningful solution to that. There's this idea we can limit ourselves. Okay, there are hundreds of opportunities to limit ourselves. Not buying a new car or using less electricity, by not using standby for our televisions and all the other apparatus. But de facto, we have a technological development which means that devices need less and less electricity. Nevertheless, our energy consumption is growing all the time. There are calculations that show that in a few hundred years, the whole surface of the Earth, if we assume that we can use solar collectors to convert solar energy into electricity, that the whole globe would have to be covered with photovoltaic panels to meet our energy needs. There'd be nowhere to look up to the sky. I think Harald Lesch mentioned this. I think it's 700 years it's going to take till we get to that point, if energy consumption carries on as it does. The next solution is, okay, well, let's do without. But what do we really want to do without? If I take the example of the car, if I don't buy a new car, then the car industry will say, oh no, collapse in our purchase figures. We live with a deep conviction that if sales don't grow, the world will come to an end. We have to increase our GDP. It has to grow 0.5%. Water meters, for example. An agency said that instead of 2.2, it's only 2.18. Not really water meters. I mean, they're measuring the economy, really, and everyone goes, oh, no. It's fallen. Italy, for example, but people are continuing to survive, amazingly, and we don't think whether there might be some real alternatives. Doing without things is a nice idea, but it's not easy, and sometimes it doesn't make sense to do without things. The stupidest thing would be to dispense with a good life, because what would be the point of that? That would be really stupid. But how can we lead a good life if we have fewer and fewer resources to do that? The point you're trying to raise is that in spite of all the things we do, we're consuming more and more all the time. I'd say that's simply a biological fact. We need air, we need water, we need food. And given the quantity, we can't find an equivalent for all of it. It wouldn't be possible. This idea of renewable energies, and that's why I mentioned photovoltaics, it only makes sense up to a certain point. We can't use renewables for our entire energy needs. What are we going to do next? Switch our television off. That wouldn't be bad. But what about the others? Will they also switch their television off? The serious background to this is that we are drifting towards a kind of future which you and I won't experience, where others will have to live with the consequences of what we're doing. And there one might ask whether that's fair, whether that's okay. Probably not. I'd assume that it isn't okay. But do we have an alternative? Probably not. The last question, but one, is what you would say to budding philosophers. An awareness of what's really important and an ability to decide what is important and what isn't, regardless of what field we're looking at. And this relates closely to the question, how can we, human beings, shape our own personalities or other personalities? It's not just about imparting them knowledge. It's of course important in medicine or law. You need to know an awful lot of stuff. But even then, what you learn during your studies, you haven't got it all in your head when you're working later on in life. Philosophy isn't really about quantities of knowledge, it's about abilities to think. And the thing is to practice on lots of different kinds of theme. That's absolutely essential, so that we can lead a self-determined and autonomous life. That should be the goal of all philosophical students. Okay, and that leads us to the last question. What really is important at the end of the day about our lives? What is the most important thing? There isn't a general answer to that. There are a lot of people who say, for me, sport is the most important thing. Others will say, no, biology or physics. And others will say, philosophy is the most important thing. It'll depend. People have different tastes. At 17, the thing that's most important thing might be quite different from when you're 27, 37, 47. It would be absurd if at the age of 17 we were to chisel our most important things in stone. That would be awful. As we live, what we find important changes. Family becomes more important as one gets older. To begin with, you think, oh, it's nice to have a partner. And then if you can have children with the partner, your own or adopted ones, to begin with, it's not quite clear what that really means. sooner or later you realize what children actually mean. And if you were to extrapolate backwards and project all those worries and joys to do with having children onto earlier years, people would be completely confused and say, oh, if I'd known then what I know now, would I really have done that? There are value schemes in life which not only change, but which evolve. And we can't extrapolate backwards and say, at one point, it's really fantastic that I've achieved that, or that I've restored my health, or that I'm able to lead a decent life with my kids and offer them a proper training and be happy with my partner. Theoretically, we don't know if we're going to be able to do those things. Otherwise, we would have to read even more books that are full of advice. They always sell well, books like that. People like these books that say, a book that can tell me how to run my life. Good. Fantastic for those who write those books. If they can sell them, helps them most of all. I'm not quite sure. I think what would help other people more would be if we could train their ability to judge. That's what we need, to use our heads and to make judgments. Professor Vossenkuhl, one very last question from me as a woman. Why are there so few women in philosophy? That's changing. In Germany, we still have relatively few. In the UK, in the United States, even in Switzerland, there are far more women in philosophy. And the numbers are growing all the time. When I studied, I think we had one female student in our top-level seminar. And she actually became a philosopher too. But it was a club for men back then. Now that's no longer the case. There are some well-known women in philosophy who are taken very seriously right across the board. It's no longer a problem. We don't have a gender problem in philosophy. In Germany still, yes, but not in other countries. Well, that's reassuring, and I just wanted to ask, because in the history of philosophy and elsewhere, you sometimes think, how did it get to this point? Okay, thank you very much.